I'm so happy to have Dana Canedy here today to talk to. I'm really excited about this. Dana is currently the vice president and publisher at Simon and Schuster, one of the five major publishing houses, big five publishing houses. Formerly, she was at the New York Times and also the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes. So great to have you, Dana.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm actually senior vice president and publisher. But
thank you for the
I'm
correction.
glad to be here. No worries.
Good to see you too. I actually, is there anything else I'm missing? I know you've had a long and illustrious career. So is there anything else that you would add to that description?
Oh, no. Thank you.
Great. So I'm just going to jump right in. So we've talked about narratives before. Last time we had on the interim director of the African American Museum of History and Culture and History Museum, and the director of the Martin Luther King Papers Project. And we talked about the importance of history there. And so really what I'm curious about with you is the importance of kind of the current cultural narratives. I know that as a reporter, you've done obviously a lot of writing, and I was struck by the kind of the raw intimacy of some of your writing. So I wonder how you think about the importance of putting out that kind of personal narrative. What's the role of that personal narrative from your perspective?
So I think the more personal the narrative and the more honest and the more raw, the more visceral people react to it and connect with it. And, I always say, I wrote a memoir that's very personal, and I always say that nobody gets a charmed life. And what you hope for is that in a life that's going to have ups and downs, that you have more ups than downs. But in those down moments, if you share those with people in a very honest way, and then sort of, explain how you overcame them, or if you're telling someone else's story, if you're able to do that, people, you can almost feel readers collectively shaking their heads. Yeah, I've been through something like that. And so I think at the core, we're all human first, whether you're red state, blue state, Republican, Democrat, whatever. And so when you can connect on a personal level like that, it breeds understanding among people who may be very different, because they realize, wow, you may be a Black woman and I might be, an older white man, but I had that same experience with my child, or I went through that with my aging parents, or, there was Alzheimer's in my family, or whatever that connection is. And then you start to see each other as humans. And so those narratives, I think, humanize people who are from different backgrounds and make them relatable to each other. And that's the beginning of then being able to have a dialogue and be open to understanding people who may not be like you.
Is that what fundamentally draws you to this work, trying to have dialogue with people that aren't like you?
Absolutely. Well, people of all kinds, people who are like me, people who are not like me, people who might draw inspiration from something that I wrote. I take that very, very, very seriously. Mm-hmm. I started writing when I was 12, and then I remember my first job out of college, I used to put my hands on the keyboard and pray and say, God, use this talent you gave me for your good. And I think that communication is the thing that helps us all in this country and in the world get better each generation, no matter what we're communicating about, right? And so throughout the arc of my career, from being a reporter at the New York Times, writing a memoir, running the Pulitzer Prizes, where I was promoting writing and journalism and storytelling, and now publishing other people's books, the arc of my career has been that I see the power in words to foster understanding, to unite us. Sometimes words anger us, but they can spur you to action. And so words, stories, narratives are a very powerful tool that help us heal, that help us grow, achieve, understand, unite. The most think about this. Probably some of the most powerful words are "I love you" or "I'm sorry they died." And so if you think about, or "it's a boy," those simple words, or "it's a girl," you can think about how they hit you. So words have power. You're fired. Will you marry me? Just those simple words, you see the power of them, right? Mm-hmm. They can be life altering. And so when you string them together in a narrative, in a way that's honest and real, they can have real power and impact.
That's certainly true. I mean, I feel that in examples you gave, and I also, though, it depends. The power depends on who you're talking to, right? So it's people bring their lived experience to the stories they hear. So I wonder how you think about that. So you tell stories, and depending on the audience, those stories could mean very, very different things. So how do you manage that?
Well, so you can speak to different kind of audiences. There's one where you're pushing on an open door and that people are receptive to the information. There are other people who may be resistant. But even then, a good story, a good narrative, you can change hearts and you can change minds. It's so funny because I'll never forget, and I think a lot of journalists have had this experience, be out reporting something and someone will say, oh, the press, I hate the press, you're all terrible, what have you. But then they'll say, oh, but not you. So,
they say that to me too. They say that to me too, by the way, but different reasons.
Yeah. But person to person and one-on-one, people connect. And through words, you can still do that through narratives. And by the way, it doesn't always have to be now on the written page, through video, through social media, through so many means that we have now, through images, whatever it takes to lure people. And look, there are going to be some people you'll never reach. Most people are either, very interested or at least open, I think, to expanding their minds and their points of view on things, or at least wanting to be informed.
Mm-hmm. This is a very optimistic view, by the way, because there are a lot of stories that aren't out there. And you'd have, one of the questions I have is like, why don't you think those stories are out there? Like, so you've done a lot of work to push some stories that hadn't been getting attention out to the broader public. But what's your thinking about why those stories weren't there? Because those people are living lives that many of us can see, but they didn't have a platform to tell their story, or people weren't telling their story. How do you think about that?
It's a very good question. And I've thought about it a lot, actually. And I think I have two answers for that are admittedly contradictory. Number one, I think there are more stories out there than the media, than publishing gets credit for. There really are. Some of them are being done by small boutique press or publishers and presses, some by university publishers. So I do think there's a lot more out there. They may not be front and center in Barnes and Noble sometimes or in Amazon, but increasingly the big booksellers are expanding the voices. They're doing more and more all the time. I was walking by a small indie bookstore a few weeks ago, and there were 3 windows of books on display, and every single window had a book, and all the books were about race. And I don't think that would have happened a few years ago. So that's the one side. The other side, the contradictory side, is that I think particularly when you're thinking of narratives of people of color, we tend to, pun intended here, we tend to think of them in bookends. The poor kid who grew up in the projects and made it to Harvard, and the kid who grew up in the projects and was shot in the streets by the police, right? People are drawn to those stories on either ends, but there are all these stories in the middle, right? And what I want to do as publisher of Simon & Schuster is tell more of those stories, and I'm committed to doing that. And I also think we're at a moment in this country where, if you look at all the marches that went on with this racial reckoning that happened this summer, it was a real rainbow of multicultural, multi-everything force that came out. And I think we have an opportunity to harness that still and capitalize on that. I think people are more open now than they've been in quite a while to wanting to understand this divide that needs to heal in this country, and books and newspaper articles and documentaries and ultimately all communication is what's going to help us do that. So somebody has to believe in that, or we have to give up.
That's true. That's true. And I'm happy that people believe in it, and people like you who are actually working on it. That's even more important. How do you think things have evolved in the past, let's say the past 20 years, right? So right now we have a racial reckoning going on, but this isn't new. I mean, we've gone through these before. And I wonder how you think about how narratives have shifted, right? So put aside just for a moment the big change, the kind of cataclysmic things we're going through right now with people on the streets. just the racial reckoning. But, 20 years is quite a bit of time. And even there, do you think things have really evolved very much prior to the current reckoning?
Absolutely, 100%. Think about what has happened in that time. We had a Black president in the White House for 8 years. We have gay marriage now in this country. And I went from being a girl who grew up working class in Kentucky to being the publisher of Simon Schuster. Honestly, we've made a lot of progress. And there's more to be made, a heck of a lot more to be made, for sure. But I think it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I would argue we're in a step back moment now. But throughout our history, that's the way it's been, is you make progress and then we as a country digress, or the world digresses, and then we keep going forward. I look at my son and his generation. They are more empathetic. They're smarter than I am. They're more diverse. They're more open-minded. And he and his friends and his peers, and that gives me hope as well. Now, I'm not Pollyannic. I understand that there is a lot of, I, like everybody else, looked at George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor case and others, and you're just heartbroken that how could this be in this era, right? But then I think about the progress we've made, and I say to myself and to my son, you got to be part of the solution and keep going forward. You just have to. Otherwise, number one, you'll lose your mind, and 2, you don't make progress.
Mm-hmm. And how has the narrative shifted? Because you admittedly said these were contradictory things, but you had the 2 bookend example. And I feel like that's been the case for quite a while now, right? Because I think they serve the dominant narrative, right, of the country is fair.
That's exactly
right. And the people who are on the end, the getting shot end, are people who deserve it. And then the people who work hard are making it and they're getting out, or what have you. So I wonder, has there been a huge change? I mean, you're optimistic and things have changed. So I do accept that. Obviously, we've had a Black president. Obviously, the success that you've had represents something important about the country. But I still feel like we're missing that huge middle, right? The narratives don't seem to have shifted that much.
Well, I think the middle is what gets overlooked. There's a huge Black middle class, and growing. There is a huge Black Latinx class and growing. Maybe to your earlier point, those stories aren't amplified enough. It doesn't make news if somebody's going to work and getting promoted, every day from, factory worker to shift supervisor to what have you. And so there are some of those stories that, quite a number, that just don't get told, for sure. No question about it. And what we have to do is find ways to both have something to say about ordinary lives, right? And get more of those voices out there in a way that people will connect with. I would like to use my book as an example. I was engaged to a wonderful man who was a soldier in the military, and he was killed in the war in Iraq when our baby was 6 months old. But he wrote a journal to him, 200 pages, and I wrote a book called A Journal for Jordan that connected with people all over the world. And it's in 10 countries and 8 languages, and is currently being made into a movie directed by Denzel Washington and starring Michael B. Jordan. And this started out, though, as me sitting in front of a blank computer and writing about a Black man from Cleveland and me, a Black woman from Kentucky, and our love story and our love of our child. And it grew into this thing because people connected with the patriotism. They connected with a man writing to his unborn son from a war, right? And so we have to find ways, there are ordinary people living extraordinary lives. And I think that's what my Charles represented. He's a hero, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and I think the media in general does do this, whether it's writing about firefighters, writing about, people getting extraordinary scholarships or a kid entrepreneur, but not always the people who just are good fathers, good mothers, who may play a small role in their church or in their communities, but have a meaningful life. And so when we can find those stories, we have to tell them. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge to want to get people to pay for a newspaper to to read a story about ordinary people living good ordinary lives, or to read a book about that. We have to find a way to figure out, how do you make people want to read about those folks? And we've done it some, but that's a challenge for me and everyone else in my industry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it seems to me that there are stories like that out there. There's just not a lot of them about people that look like me. And by that, I mean, I don't know that if I live an extraordinary life, wherever I come from, I think that could be seen as story worthy. But if I just lived, an interesting but middle class life, and I look the way I look, I'm not certain that there's going to be a story written about me. And
Well,
that's
I
not
am
just because
agreeing
I don't
with
think
you.
they exist, because they are stories like that look like other people look like that. I mean, I can read stories like that.
No, I disagree with that. I think if there was a white factory worker in Detroit working in a factory, and I went to my editors of the New York Times and said, I want to write about this guy, they'd say, what's the next paragraph? There has to be a reason for that story, right? There has to be a news narrative. There has to be an arc to the story. So it is true that our stories of people of color, are the ones that are most overlooked, no matter where you are on the spectrum. That's for sure. But I don't think there are a lot of books about anybody that are just about ordinary people living ordinary lives. There has to be a story there.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more on the fiction side, right? So when I read fiction where it's an attempt to like illuminate the vagaries of life, and it doesn't have to be, you went from a Horatio Alger story, right? That's not necessary. And I don't see that many stories that are detailed and nuanced about people like me. Right. So I agree with you on certainly in the real life and the nonfiction genre. But when you think about fiction and as the publisher, you'll see quite a bit of that, I'm sure. Like in that space, I also don't see a lot of stories that capture just the experience of life.
Yeah, well, there can certainly be more. There's no question. But if you think about people like Colton Whitehead and some of the work that he's done, and others, I do think that they are out there. Yeah. Again, it's my challenge to make sure we amplify more of those voices. That's why I'm in this job.
Mm-hmm. That also made me think about, you brought up your book, your memoir about your husband, which is obviously incredibly touching, and it's affecting, like you said, a lot of people because it's so intimate. And then one of the things I thought about was your son, and also you had an article about having a talk with your son, and it made me reflect on the divergence in terms of like the way you both came up. Like obviously you are intimately connected as any two people could be. And yet the experience is like you're coming up in Kentucky and him coming up, given the life that you all lead now together, is an interesting divergence. And it makes me think about economic mobility and race and the complexities of all that. So I'm just curious of what's your story about that? Like, how do you experience that?
I'm so proud of it. Every parent wants their children to do better than they did. And my child is smarter than me. He will be more successful than I will ever dream of being. He's more empathetic. He's kinder. He's funnier. That's what every parent wants. And with God's grace, that will only get amplified. But he's humble. I make sure Jordan walks in many different lives. He was in a rite of passage program that was 9 months based in Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem for, Black boys. And he's also been to synagogue with his friends and gone to bar mitzvahs. He is as comfortable at a barbershop in Harlem as he is going to the Waldorf Astoria or to any sushi restaurant in Manhattan. He has friends who live in the projects, and he has friends who live in multi-million-dollar mansions. He prays every night, and he asks God to protect those who don't have. And so he just has an empathetic soul. He spends a lot of time in Kentucky, where I grew up, and it's one of the number one places he wants to be. He runs there. I mean, he just wants to be there. He likes to fish, but he also, likes some of the finer things, like he's a surfer. So he's well-rounded, smart, empathetic, racially aware, has very strong political views. He can tell you anything you want to know about the Electoral College and which states Biden needed to win, which states Trump was likely to win. He could tell you all of that.
Mm-hmm. So I mean that's incredible. He sounds like an amazing person, and congratulations on that, by the way. That must feel amazing.
Thank you.
You know,
It does, but let me say this. To get to that point, we had to overcome a lot of grief. You know, like I had to dig out of a hole. His dad died in a Humvee in Iraq when he was 6 months old. And I say to people always, yeah, we are where we are now, but it's not like anybody hit a fast forward button. It took a lot to get us to this point, a hell of a lot. Mm-hmm. And I say, and I'll say to anybody listening here today, success looks different at different points in your life. You all at Stanford, that looks very successful. The day his father died, success for me was getting off the floor. And the next week, success for me was getting out of bed. And now success for me is publisher of Simon & Schuster. And so life has an arc to it. And so it's easy to say, wow, look how your son lives. But it took a lot to get us to this point, and I'd give it all back to have his father here.
Yeah, I can imagine. And when I was thinking about it, I was wondering how other people that are doing well, but came from more humble beginnings and having kids and raising the next generation, like how do we think about the narrative arc there? What's their place and those children's place in all of this, right? In the
anywhere they want to go. It's anywhere they want to go. And I think the mistake parents make is trying to prescribe that for them. Mm-hmm. Let them be who they're going to be. People often ask me, you know, how would you feel if Jordan wanted to go in the military? I mean, I wouldn't be able to breathe, but it would be his choice. My job is not to control him. It's to try to mold him to be who he is meant to be. And so I don't spend a lot of time worrying about that. I make sure that he's racially aware. I make sure that he understands that not everybody lives the way we live. I make sure he spends time with his elders and with his cousins in Kentucky who don't live the way he lives. And then I give him the best education I can possibly give him. We have honest conversations, and then he will show me what his divine path is and who he's meant to be, and I have to support that.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what's interesting about this is obviously you have an awesome responsibility in being a parent, as any parent does, but also now you have the ability to shape the narratives that other people see, that most people that you won't even meet. And I wonder how you think about that responsibility, right? It's one thing when it's intimate, it's your son, you have values, you want to impart those values. It's something else when it's people around the world who might be reading this story or reading this book, and you are having an influence on how they see the world. Like, how do you think about that responsibility?
That's why I'm doing what I do. That's what I did at the New York Times. That's what I did before I arrived at the Times, both as a reporter telling other people's stories, but also as an editor, shaping not just my stories, but the front page of the New York Times or the national section of the New York Times. And now at Simon & Schuster, through the books that we acquire, you know, I have to approve every acquisition, every single one. And so I have conversations with my editors about why this book over that, why this author over this one. You know, we had an imprint called 37 Inc. that was devoted to books by and about authors of color. I broke that up because I want all of my editors doing this. I want them to be front and center Simon & Schuster books, and they're all going to be expected to do these books. And so, you know, I'm trying to influence narratives through the hiring that I'm doing. I just hired a woman. I want to expand who's in publishing. So I hired a woman who is the publisher of the Miami Herald, and she's probably the highest ranking Latina in journalism. And now she's coming over to Simon & Schuster to acquire books. And by the way, I don't want her to move to New York. She'll come to New York once a month post-COVID, meet with agents and authors and colleagues, but she's going to stay in Miami. You know, what a rich place for her to explore stories and to connect with local and regional authors and to get more of those voices that you're talking about and those stories that you're talking about. So those are the ways that I'm trying to influence what we're doing at Simon & Schuster. And I think it will have an impact on my competitors as well. At least I'm hopeful that it will.
That'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. And
I'm going to do more of that.
Yeah, I want to point out something was in an article that referenced you, talked about you in the New York Times, and it said Miss Canedy is now poised to become one of the most powerful Black women in the literary world, with the ability to alter the culture and the divisions she leads and shape the landscape. Right, and what you said is what you're looking to do is to acquire books that are completely out of the box. What does that
Hmm.
mean? What does that look like? What is a completely out of the box?
So it means different things. It means what I was saying before about stories in between the bookends, but it could also mean a story told from Appalachia or from the Midwest, that had from a unique or an emerging voice. It's one of my strengths as an editor, and one of the reasons I did, what I did at the New York Times for as long as I did is I know those stories when I see them. And so as I'm going through this proposal, that's what I'm looking for. That's why Mindy is in Miami, so she can scout, the territory there and tell the stories from the ground at the local level that we would never hear of in New York City. So I'm just starting to influence that now with some acquisitions that I've made, some that have been announced and some that haven't yet. It's going to take at least a year for me to really start having an impact in this regard. But I think it is finding unique, different, emerging voices from people who may have not gotten a book deal from Simon Schuster before, and taking a bet on those people and linking them up with good editors. And as I said, that means it could be a Black author, but it could be a white author from Appalachia telling a story from a town there. And so my editors and I have been talking a lot about this, and I've told them, that I really want them to think of this as the year of innovation, even though Simon & Schuster's having one of the best years in its history, so they're already innovative. But I want to break things. I want you to come with ideas you never would have brought to the story meetings before. And we'll see over the next year, but they're already starting to do that. And so it's going to take a while, but it's why I took this job, because I had a position that I loved and could have retired in. And I really wanted to be a part of influencing what people are reading in this country and around the world.
Mm-hmm. So I like that you said you want to try new things and maybe break things. That often can produce some pushback. That's how it works. So I'm curious, one, about when you were at the Pulitzer Prize, administrating the Pulitzer Prizes. You were there when Kendrick Lamar won the prize for his album "Damn." I'm
Yeah.
curious. There was a little bit of, I don't know if there. You can tell me if there was blowback. I'm curious about that. But there was certainly a little bit of both excitement and I would call it, say, consternation about that.
Yes.
How do you think about that? How do you think about those
I
kind of
loved
responses?
it. I loved it. Good. That's what we were supposed to be doing, right? Change, good change and bad change is jolting. And it was a jolt in the best possible sense. He deserved it on the work. I mean, he's remarkable. He's brilliant. And there wasn't as much consternation as you would think. I was expecting more. There were a couple of rumblings, but most everybody was like, oh my God, yeah, of course. And so I was proud. This was a very daring and bold selection by the Pulitzer Board, who, by the way, voted unanimously on this. And we were very proud of it. And then I'm telling you, there were a few, people who grumbled, but not much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great, because he deserved it.
No, I thought that was an incredible album. I was happy that he won it for sure. He certainly, in my opinion anyway, deserved it. And when you think about what you're doing here, like what's the consequence of something like that? Like what are you trying to achieve? So when this happens, or when you put these books out of here that are outside the box, like, what's the goal? And how do you know if you're actually getting there?
Mm-hmm. So goals and consequences are two different things. I don't worry about consequences that much, because if you do that, you're going to be paralyzed and you won't be as innovative as you might otherwise be, or as entrepreneurial. I like disruption. So I don't worry about consequences. I try to take calculated risks, and not be reckless, but I really don't worry about the consequences. In terms of the goal, it's to is to do what I've done my entire career. Engage people in conversations that enrich our understanding of one another, enhance and uplift each other, foster, real communications, and to, when possible, get people who may have not ever seen your point of view to at least consider your point of view. And so if I have authors who are making people angry, but not in a provocative way just to be provocative, but because they're awakening something in someone, or if they're fostering understanding of something that a reader has never thought about from a different point of view, that's success. Now, obviously, publishing is a money-making business. We want to sell a lot of books, right? And so take, for example, the Mary Trump book, which was ours. That's a book where we took a chance. We didn't know, who was going to want to read this book. And do you know that it's now the best-selling book in Simon & Schuster's history? We sold 1 million copies on the day it came out.
Dana, you didn't know if that was going to be a success? Come on.
No. Because you know why? I'll tell you. We didn't know she wasn't an author. And so, we had an editor who was really brilliant. But you take a chance when you take an unknown author writing about a family member, even if it is the president, right? And to pull that together into something that's that powerful, even if we thought it was going to be a bestseller, which I'm not sure anybody knew at the beginning. We knew it had potential, which is why we took a chance on it. Nobody thought it would be the best-selling book in Simon & Schuster history. It's incredible. Now, why is that? I think it's because, Donald Trump has been so polarizing that people on both sides really want to understand him and his hold on, a huge part of this country. And she was the best person to, as it turns out, explain that, because she knew him personally, and she's also a psychologist. And so, it had resonance, and the book is still selling well because people are still grappling with what have we just been through.
So when you have issues like that, so that's an interesting example, because she was obviously well placed to make an argument or tell a story about what was going on, given her personal experience. And when you think about, I'm going to tie that to race a bit, right? There's been some issues around who gets to tell the stories of ethnic minorities and Black folks in particular, but other groups as well. And in the industry, people have gotten a lot of pushback for writing about things that others thought they didn't have the credibility or shouldn't have been able to tell that story. So I guess I'm curious, who gets to tell the story? Because there's not, like, in my mind, there's not a reality out there, right? Everyone is telling a story, and if you have the ability or the platform to go tell a story, you get to shape reality for people. That's a powerful thing.
I agree. Yeah, I agree completely with that. I think it's not a simple answer. I think obviously you want authentic stories. That's number one. And whoever can tell that story authentically is who should be telling it. And so, obviously, if you're writing about race, you want people who are living that experience to tell that story. But you also could have people who aren't necessarily living that experience, but are somehow, related to that experience. In other words, if we're writing stories about the civil rights movement, obviously we want people who went through the movement. And that could be a Black minister from Atlanta. It could be a white person who left a farm in Kansas to go march with Dr. King. I mean, as long as there's authenticity there. In my book, I wrote a lot about the military, and I wasn't a military expert, but I had to become one. And so the number one thing I think it takes is authenticity to tell a story. It's not the who, it's the authenticity. And then again, it is the who, because in order to have authenticity, you have to have people who have lived those experiences to tell the story. So the answer is, it's not one type of person who can tell a reality, who can write about someone's reality. It's whoever has the best up close view, as long as you're including people who've actually lived it and are experiencing whatever the it is.
The authenticity is a complicated thing. That's in my mind, that's a charged word, right? Because who gets to judge who's authentic and who's not? right? Because that's what it
It's
comes
not,
down to.
yeah, it's not a charged word for me because I'm a journalist. And so I'm trained to get at authenticity. And again, I'll go back to that military story. You know, there's a chapter in my book that reconstructed the last 24 hours of Charles's life, my Charles. I didn't know anything about Iraq or military culture at war or any of that before I wrote that. And I was able to do it because what you have to do is you have to hear every side of an argument. You have to do your research. You have to look at records. You know, you have to know where your biases are so that you overcompensate for them. I was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about race in America. And I wrote a story about two newspaper columnists from Akron, Ohio, as part of this series, who were dueling in the newspaper over issues of race. And I realized I really didn't like the white guy in the story. And I was like, why is this? It was because he was macho. And so what I did was I spent a lot of time with him and his wife and his kids at his house, sitting by his pool, sipping iced tea, because I needed to be authentic to him. His voice needed to be authentic in my story, and I knew I was having a visceral reaction to him. And so I went overboard to understand him and to make sure I didn't necessarily agree with some of his views, but that he was represented with his authentic voice. And so it can be done. It is hard to do, but the best work, and that's what we strive to do at Simon Schuster, is to buy books that we think where the author has an authentic story to tell, and then to use our editing skills to make sure we get at that. And oftentimes, an author will come in thinking they have an authentic story, and it's not until the fifth or sixth draft that you get there.
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. I'm going to use a term that can certainly be charged for people. The woke left. Let's say they're pushing back on someone's authenticity. How do you think about that?
They're doing what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. They're doing what?
The woke left. You know, there's a group of people who will push back on things that they decide are outside of the bounds of, say, we can use the word authenticity, right? So there's a writer and they've decided this person doesn't have the appropriate background or credentials. How do you respond to that? What do you think about that kind of movement?
So it's hard, it's hard for me to think of that in the abstract. I'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Mm-hmm. They'd have to prove their point. Just because somebody makes an accusation doesn't make it true. Mm-hmm. And so they would absolutely have to prove it. You know, again, going back to my New York Times days, there were times where sources would kick and scream and demand corrections. You got this wrong and you know you didn't. And you have to prove that. And so honestly, I would have to have a case in front of me. But if that came up, we'd go through it. We'd go through the evidence and see where we ended up on that. But I think we get it right more than we get it wrong. Do we get it wrong both in the media and in publishing? Absolutely, 100%, of course. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a difference between propaganda, you know, in terms of some of these groups attacking the press and publishing as sport almost, and going back to the word authenticity, an authentic claim. And so I would take it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. And what do you think are the limits of narrative? So just a moment ago, I said that I think narrative is incredibly powerful, right? Because it shapes our experience of reality. In some sense, you could argue that it creates reality for us from these disparate pieces of experience. But what are the limits from your perspective of narrative?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about fiction or nonfiction. If you're talking about fiction, it's virtually limitless. If you're talking about nonfiction, the limits are the truth of the arc of the story. It has to stay within the bounds of what's true. And so the story guides what the limits are in any nonfiction book, right? But in fiction, you know, one of the wonderful things is authors push the envelope all the time and push the bounds of storytelling. And that's healthy and really wonderful. Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking in particular, like, let's say we were talking earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement and all the people on the streets. And then there needs to be a bridge somewhere between that and like policy change. And I
Mm-hmm.
like to think of them both as kind of different narratives, right? So you have the narrative about what the nature of this country is and Black Lives Matter as a movement, but also a narrative that's underlying that movement. And then you have policy, like what the country should be from a different perspective. Like, does narrative bridge those two things? Is it just they just run parallel in their own narrative space? Like, how do we think
It
about
can.
this?
It certainly can. If you think about, for example, mothers against drunk driving, right? And I would say now the mothers of Black young boys and girls who've been shot by the police, but going back earlier to mothers against drunk driving, that started as mothers in grief over these horrible tragedies, and became a movement, and became people who influenced policy, certainly. Or if you think about God bless them, the Sandy Hook parents, those stories started out as these horrible, visceral stories about the kids, and then they pivoted into harnessing their political power. The same with the Parkland kids in Florida. And so out of tragedy sometimes, or out of even, hopeful stories in some cases about people who have, overcome a great amount, you can start in one place and end up in another in terms of policy along the way becoming a part of the narrative.
Mm-hmm. I see. Because I'm just thinking about what's the role of, like, you're as the head of a publishing house, as the publisher at Simon Schuster, what's your role in terms of shaping policy? I mean, the books you choose will have an effect. You brought up the Mary Trump book. That's one example, but I'm sure you could think of dozens of others. Like, how do you think about that role of the broader responsibility to society?
I don't think of it as shaping policy. I think of it as influencing policy that will then be shaped. In other words, if we put stories out there that expose a wrongdoing, hopefully that shapes policy, or that influences policy, I should say. If we put stories out there about, climate change that help understand, the need for some policy changes, that's great. Our job is to inform, enlighten, and spur people to action. Those are the most, in my view, the most successful books. And if you do that, you do influence policy, I suppose, in the end. So I think of it as I've said throughout this conversation, using the power of words to influence. And then if you do that successfully, policy will change.
Uh-huh. So I'm going to go back to what the New York Times said about you, one of the most powerful Black women. I'm just going to say one of the most powerful people. I don't know why they have these, why they have these modifiers, right? So one of the most powerful people in the literary world, right? You make choices. The idea that, like, you're just informing people, like, yes, and there are choices you make about what information gets amplified, right? So you have a lot of power, right? And so how do you think about using that? Like, what do you, are you willing to, like, say, here are my goals, this is what the direction I want things to move and how I want people to think about things, and I'd love to have stories that help people understand this and that better. How do you manage that power, that responsibility?
Well, I think I've been saying that through the whole conversation this evening. My goal is to look as wide but also as deep as we possibly can to find stories that really influence what people think about culture, what they think about race, what they think about religion, what they think about what's happening in Washington. And by the way, I don't have to recreate the wheel. Simon & Schuster's already doing that. Mm-hmm. What I need to do is just to make sure that we broaden the types of authors who are telling those stories, and I am doing that, and that I hire editors that bring different perspectives, and that they're not all sitting in, based in New York, working in parts of the country where they're on the ground and can, be receiving the kinds of information in their communities that might make them think there's a narrative there that we wouldn't know sitting in New York. And so all of that, to my mind, influences the conversations I have with my editors about the books they acquire, the questions I ask them, the way I probe them, and the messages I send over and over about the kind of books that I want to acquire. I'm 3 months into this, and they're learning, what I want. and we're having lots and lots of meetings and conversations. I brought somebody in who's an African-American male just to talk to them about creativity. He wasn't in the book industry. And so it's going to be a process. I think, I'm in phase 1 of that process, which has been to, make my first strategic hires. I'm about to make another one, acquire my first books, have lots and lots and lots of conversations with my staff about, where I want to go, and then hear from them about their ideas for what they want to do, but also how they can help me achieve what I think I've been brought on to Simon & Schuster to do.
Mm-hmm. And do you see, and not in particular Simon Schuster, do you see, or do you think that there's resistance in the publishing industry? Does it seem conservative in a way that is something you feel like should change or needs to change, or just wonder where it was when you came in, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's the reputation of publishing. I think it's opening up. There's been, since I was named publisher of Simon & Schuster, there's been a lot of other publishing houses that have either started imprints to focus on, content by people of color, or they've made, promotions of folks to positions sort of like mine. So I think the industry right now, again, and this is across industries, because of this racial reckoning that's going on in the country, at least in this moment, there seems to be more of an openness than there has been in a while, but there's a long way to go. Mm-hmm. There just is. We have to do a lot more hiring, and we have to do a lot more of telling the stories of the kind of people that you've been describing tonight.
Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the people who are watching and will listen are business students or business leaders. What would you tell them? What would you want to leave them with?
So I would say the message for me doesn't have to do with a specific industry. It's really be open to the kind of people you bring in and hire. It's easy to hire, promote, or sponsor, which is the way of bringing someone along, somebody who looks like you or that you're comfortable with. Broaden what you see as talent and be open and by the way, it's not for social reasons. It's just good business. This country is going to continue to be more diverse year after year, generation after generation. And imagine the New York Times trying to write the racial reckoning story right now with no Black reporters. The product, if you will, would suffer. And so I think that the hopeful thing is that students of this generation are already more open than the generation before. But I'd say even push to be more than you are, willing to have a diverse staff, to promote people who don't look like you, and to be the leaders on what could be a movement, a racial reckoning in business.
Mm-hmm. And for people who are nervous about change, because change can be frightening, right? So people who are nervous about it or uncertain, what would you tell them?
So we're all nervous about it. Let me tell you a little story. I've told this story to even the publisher of the New York Times. When I was first out of school, I applied for a job at the Miami Herald, and they were owned by a chain called Knight Ridder at the time. And they literally gave a written psychological exam. And I asked them, "What are you looking for?" And they said, "Insecure overachievers." And think about that. It's the perfect employee. And I used to say the New York Times hired all those people without the exam. If you're an overachiever, you're running on that little hamster wheel, right? As fast as you can. But if you're insecure, you don't know you're running on it faster than everybody else, so you run faster. And so everybody has some level of imposter syndrome. And so if you're scared of change, and I am too, by the way, I always say this: you can be scared and do it, or you can be scared and not do it. So you might as well do it.
Well, on that note, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. You might as well do it. I really appreciate the time, and it was a really fun conversation. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Good luck to everybody.
Thanks.
Stay safe. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this conversation and you want to listen to other conversations, feel free to download Leadership Society, Race and Power, wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you all.